Greetings all, welcome to another session here of Tuesday Talks. Today we're going to be looking at some of the philosophies of second language acquisition. This is going to be more of a quick overview. I will talk about in other sessions a little more detail. Today we're going to look at some of the earlier versions, the structural and behavioral. We'll then move on to generative linguistics. And then we'll move on to the constructivist and more things that are a little bit more modern things that you can see in the 21st century. Let's begin by looking at the philosophies of the 1950s and 60s, the structural behavioralists. A lot of this comes in line right around the time of Skinner's ideas of verbal behavior. Verbal behaviorism was a book that he had purchased. Basically, he believed that the child, when they were born, they came with a blank slate, and we kind of just poured everything into it. And the best way to learn was stimulus and response. Okay, and basically the brain was empty and it needed to be filled in, and we were only going to look at the more scientific type of method where you have testing and then results, testing and then results. And so he focused on that in his studies here. Now, around the late 1950s, middle of the 1960s, there was a gentleman who came in whose name was Noam Chomsky. He is still alive today. He's an MIT professor. He began his work in generative linguistics, generative meaning to generate or to create. It was a school of thought within linguistics that makes use of the concept of a generative grammar, a grammar that can create any type of system. Like our alphabet, we only have 26 letters, and yet we can create an innumerable number of words based on the way you combine things. Same thing would be with the rules of grammar. You have the rules, and you can create anything you want with those rules. So that was the concept. There was a set of rules that allowed you to create all these different possible sentences. When you look at grammar, you do see a set of rules. When you see that syntax, all these rules and how you create things based on those rules. Then based off of that systematicity and also some of the behavioral, the neurolinguistics things, came cognitive psychology, where they were looking at what processes were being involved in the brain to take memories and take them from short term and put them into long term. So this was more important than just stimulus response, but it also had elements of the rationality of language within it. So let's take a quick look at some of the impact of some of these things. With regard to generative linguistics, the idea that you could generate information, this idea ran counter to Skinner's ideas is with regard to, just listen and repeat, stimulus response type of thing. Chomsky and his other researchers demonstrated that kids, when they were learning language, learned these rules, and you could make up a word. You could make up the word obligor. I don't even know what obligor is, but if I wanted to make it plural, I would have to add an S to it. Or if I made it a verb, he was bliggered. What's he doing? He's bliggering. And you see how these children would take a made-up word, they'd never heard it before, and yet they applied these rules to that word. Okay, so that ran counter to this whole idea of stimulus response. They simply repeat what they heard. No, they understood the grammar behind it. And why did they do that? Because they had some sort of innate ability. They had something inside their brain before they learned to communicate. They had this ability. They had these skills. Some would even call it a language acquisition device at some point. But it was something within the brain. The brain was pre-wired to allow people to communicate via language. So that was a huge plus to language understanding, but it was also a blow to this whole idea of stimulus response and verbal behavior. The dichotomy here is great. You've got on the one end, you have people who say, just stimulus response, just drill it into them type of thing. And you have the other end who says, no, you have these rules already in their head. We simply need to find some way to activate them. And so you have this battle going on. It's actually still going on today in some groups. Other groups have said, look, it's actually a merging of the two. And that I can see that to be more of the case. In any event, let's move on. Interlanguage, an idea first coined by Selinker. He posited the idea that the brain has a set of rules for language, but those rules are not set in stone. They're kind of in between. The rules they have in someone's head and the rules that most people have with regard to syntax are different. And eventually kids, they learn, as they're learning to understand these rules and to process them properly, the rules in their head, these temporary rules, or this interlanguage, these temporary rules in the brain, are constantly being upgraded. They're being upgraded because the user, either cognitively or subconsciously, recognizes a difference between the way they pronounce, they speak, they communicate, and the way the majority of the people around them communicate. So that was this whole idea of interlanguage. Another idea that came out of this research of the brain via the cognitive psychologists and generative linguistics was the idea of systematicity. Children at all levels, children regardless of their language, tend to learn language at the same, in the same manner, in the same system. And there was research of the variety of languages and children and how they progressed. And this also fits in a little bit with Piaget and his ideas about child development. And we got to see that through actual evidence. So we got to see this systematicity. Also got to begin to develop the idea of language universals, that within every language there are certain components that exist, that are. Not that they have to be, but that they are. And they began to see these universals within language, that all languages have subjects, and they all have verbs. And obviously they may be formed and fashioned in certain ways, but they do have them. And then, of course, there was this idea of a deep structure within language. And the idea here was that the deep structure in language are elements that can be used in any language, rules that can be used in any language. So that the rules, the deep structure, is the same regardless of the child, regardless of their first language. So that if a kid is born in Korea and they begin to hear Korean around them, that activates the rules already in their head, and they tweak a few variables so that Korean comes out normally. Take this kid at a very young age and bring him to Germany, and those rules then are going to be retweaked so that he can learn German faster. And those deep structures are always going to be the same. It's the minor tweaking of the variables that will allow them to go, one way or the other depending on the language. That was the deep structure. All of these ideas came out as a result of things that Chomsky had initiated, and then later cognitive psychologists discovered through their research. Fascinating work since the 1960s and on. And this is all within the fields of generative linguistics, cognitive psychology, and even you could go into things like neurolinguistics with regard to memory study. We'll talk about that at a later time. The newest area in second language acquisition is this whole idea of Constructivism. It's a multidisciplinary approach, and it's the basic idea of a constructivist idea is where you build your reality. You construct your identity and your ideas of language in a community. And so it's a lot of negotiated work. It's a multidisciplinary approach, as I mentioned before. Part of it comes from the ideas of Vygotsky and Bakhtin. And Vygotsky was basically talking about the need for the other. He talked about scaffolding and zones of proximal development and how we needed the surrounding in order to develop language. And Bakhtin was one who stressed the idea that we weren't alone, that you cannot communicate or create language in a vacuum, that language requires the other, and that there really are no new ideas, quote unquote, but that ideas come as an interaction of the other. So we needed that other when developing language. Piaget also talked about the discovering ideas, discovering language approach, and how it's a developmental type of thing. So you combine these ideas along with the rules that are in the head from the generative grammar people, and you begin to have this idea of a constructivist idea. I have the rules, but the rules cannot function unless I'm in a community, unless I have some group that can help scaffold me to develop what this language is. Vygotsky's zone of proximal development, or ZPD as I put it here, is the difference between what a learner can do without help and what he or she can do with help. A child learning a first language, if there is no other around, as Bakhtin would say, they're not going to learn language. And that's been evidenced before by people who where somehow as a little baby they were left out in the woods and they were raised by somebody or whatever, and they couldn't communicate. They had very much difficulty communicating. So we need the other. And in this whole idea of a constructivist approach, we use the other to help us grow. And there are now communities of learning where people work together as a community and they construct ideas and meanings as they go. Very different from the earlier versions in science, where it was much more of an evolutionary, we're going to win and we're going to destroy you type of idea. So we have this new constructivist idea. Some of the ideas that are brought about because of the constructivist multidisciplinary approach are interactive discourse. And so they now stress much more interaction in order to develop communication, in order to develop the negotiation of meaning, in order to develop fluency. Those things are important. There are socio-cultural variables that have now been the focus of some language research. The fact that in some cultures men and women don't communicate nearly as often as they do, or that there are different ways that people communicate. There are some cultures they communicate more directly and more indirectly, and these are variables when you have students coming from different cultures trying to interact in this multidisciplinary approach, things that we need to take into consideration. We have cooperative learning, again, a big emphasis in constructivist approach, where people work together to build language. And so you have students who have difficulty learning who have a limited ability in a language, but they're working together, and as they work together, they enhance fluency, they enhance the negotiation of meaning, and so they're learning language through this cooperative learning. Another approach that comes from this is discovery learning or inquiry-based learning, where it's kind of like students are given the ability to go explore, to find new things and learn new things, or that they go do a research. And as they're doing their research, they're not only researching, idea X or question B, but they're also learning language as they go along. And so finally we talk about the construction of learning, which is really all these areas we're talking about, where you're constructing components, and in so doing you are going through this learning process. Language, learning, and teaching today. Now, what does this all mean as we look at these theories, and how did they play out in the classroom? The older methods that we probably all grew up with if we're my age. One would be your classical grammar translation method. You got some text, you translated it into the main language, and that was really all you did. Boring, and there was no verbal oral skills whatsoever, but I could read it and I can translate it, and those are the main things that were important. Off of Skinner's work came the audiolingual method, and the emphasis there was very much on listening and responding. In fact, in the more traditional audiolingual method, there was no reading and there was no writing. The teacher would speak and you would respond. You would learn stock phrases and you would repeat them so that you would know what those stock phrases are. You also have something called the direct method. The direct method was a very useful way of learning language. It was basically immersion in the classroom. The moment you walk into the classroom, you hear nothing but the target language. And people who are very strict with this, they don't want to hear any primary language. They only want to hear target language. I usually try to stay in the target language, although there would be times where I have jumped into native speaker. For example, when I lived in Japan, and I would jump into Japanese to answer questions or whatnot, but a more strict person would definitely stay only in the target language. And it's frustrating for some students because they want to understand. They have their cognitive abilities, but they're being forced into learn the way you learn a first language type of thing. Now, eventually, you've got two types of students in a direct method type of classroom. Either they quit because they're too frustrated, or they go and they succeed. They get over their frustration and they begin to succeed. And lastly, we have communicative language teaching, and this involves more of the communicative base, where there is this, well, suffice it to say, more of the direct method type of things going on in the classroom, and the focus is less on learning language and more on communicating. Now, the syntactical lexical elements are still there, but they're not in the forefront as it would be like in the grammar translation method. Now the forefront is going to be communicating, and you as a teacher want to encourage your students to communicate more, and as they're enjoying this communication, they're also learning language. This is, again, more of the constructivist idea of language teaching. And those are some of the changes that have come about now. We have other things here that I could have talked about. I could have talked about task-based language teaching, where, again, the task is the objective, and they are trying to accomplish some task, whether it's to write a resume or to take a bus to the train station. They have a task that they have to complete, and they have to do it in the target language. Again, the task is now the focus instead of communicating, but still, they're going to be learning language as they go through the process. And though it's a quick summary of some of the philosophies of second language acquisition and where they come from and how one has superseded another, and yet at the same time there is still a mishmash of them. I really do like what Brown says regarding second language acquisition, that he's more of an eclectic. He's taking some ideas from a variety of these places and try to pull it together to form a more overarching, more inclusive type of theory of second language acquisition. That's all I have for today. If you do have any questions, you can certainly give me a holler on email or on Skype, and I'll talk to you later. Bye-bye now.